Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of GIANT's Healthy Innovators Live TV. I'm your host. My name is Barry Shrier, and I'm the founder of GIANT Health. I'd like to say thank you to our many thousands of listeners from around the world. We love working with you guys, our global community of nearly 200,000 people now, everybody whose business is healthcare, technology, and innovation. We'd also like to thank our sponsors. So thanks, of course, to our knowledge partner, McKinsey & Co., thank you to our sponsors, Vodafone and Barclays Bank. Thank you to Helpify and Eli Lilly. And we'd also like in particular to thank a sponsor, Waracle, who are sponsoring the GIANT Health event coming up on the 30th of November, 1st of December. So we invite all of our listeners to go to our website, www.giant.health, and to get a ticket to come to our big annual event, the GIANT Health event, which is in London, sponsored by Waracle. And the event is taking place at the Business Design Centre in central London. The event is what the Financial Times newspaper refers to as Europe's largest, most valuable annual healthcare tech event. So if you work in healthcare and you have an interest in technology and innovation, we would love to see you, and we invite you to come to the GIANT Health event. Today I have David from Waracle. Hello, David. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good afternoon.
Nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining this episode. Every week we bring together quite literally world-leading innovators in the area of healthcare and technology. So very proud to have you joining us today. We'd like to begin, please, by just saying, what's an example of a big challenge in society, a big problem in healthcare? And how can that be addressed, for example, with mobile technologies or mobile apps?
So the big challenge for society with healthcare, and particularly where it pertains to technology, is that the need for healthcare and the demand on it never goes away and only gets bigger. And like everything else in society, trying to make things more efficient, smaller, and more personal is the answer to that. And it's no different with healthcare than it was with shopping in the 1990s when Amazon brought certain technologies to market and very early to prove commerce could be moved online very successfully. And in the last year, you've seen up to half the commerce in the world is done that way in the developed world, certainly. So taking some of these principal designs and techniques that have been developed over the years to the very personal worlds of healthcare and finances where Waracle takes part, whether that is enabling the advancement of technology to improve outcomes for people, whether it's to detect things early before people even know they have certain health conditions, or somewhere in the middle where technology bridges that gap between diagnosis and treatment. That's where technology takes its place and tries to scale and heavily personalize the outcomes of patients and future patients.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. These are big challenges in society and in healthcare. You mentioned the theme of early detection. In case some of our listeners aren't necessarily medical professionals or deeply involved directly in the provision of healthcare, what do you mean by early detection, and why is that a big deal? What does it matter?
It's very important. So early detection has come a long way in the last few years, more specifically because of things like wearables and sensors becoming much more prevalent. So if you think about the development of things like Apple Watch, Fitbit technologies, and others,
Okay.
applying the sort of ambient use of technology, ambient being that you don't know it's actually doing anything, it's in the background and picking up background conditions. For example, Apple Watches, because they have technology that used to be used for directions and trying to tell you where to be and where you are in the world, those have got so accurate. The actual movement of the watch in your hand in micro movements can detect the early sign of Parkinson's disease. For example, before you even know you have a very minor tremor, technology is so accurate it can pick things like that up. So you can actually start to diagnose things before you knew you had them. I have a personal example of this whereby last year, when COVID tests were very scarce, I had the classic symptoms, but not enough to attend hospital, therefore couldn't get tests. So I didn't know if I actually had COVID. But my watch was telling me my oxygen had dropped because there is a sensor in there that shines a light through your veins, essentially, and takes a machine-learned guess at what your oxygen component is. And I dropped to about 90%, which is pretty bad, but in the scheme of things then it wasn't admissible. But still, that was happening without me even knowing it. I found that out 6 months later, looking at a graph the watch produced. So early detection takes many forms, but those are the ambient ones that people don't even know they're offering.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's extremely interesting. Could you give us other examples of early detection? And that's one question. And then a follow-up question is, so does this only help people who are, what do you want to call it, the digital cognoscenti, the early adopters, the young trendy people who are the first people to buy very expensive watches?
Not necessarily. So some of this can actually be applied in clinical settings as well. So if you think about
Okay.
putting similar forms of technology into a clinician's hand to give them a guide where their traditional techniques of diagnosing a disease, for example, can be augmented by that kind of technology. So, for example, if you were to put a sensor with audio technology to somebody's veins, you can detect whether the veins are actually pulsing at a certain rate, and you can tell if vascular disease is taking place.
Wow.
And that kind of thing, you can turn that into technology, which over time you start to pick up signals. So if you recorded, let's just for an example say 500 people's pulse in a particular part of their body that's got a particularly good signal for a pulse,
Okay.
you may be able to tell if that limb is in danger. Now, if you record enough of them and clinician says, right, of those 500, these particular 5 went down a particular pathway that
Yeah.
they needed treatment to unblock the vascular condition, or even at the extreme end to remove the limb which was affected by it. If
Yes.
you get much earlier detection of these things just by applying the technology and the analysis of it, which is the important bit, you can actually start the pathway a lot earlier. So instead of treatment at the extreme end, which could be an amputation, you could go a little
Sure.
bit earlier and apply medication to it. And that's where it's much more available to anyone, where you're just making somebody's decision easier and bringing it forward effectively.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Well, David, that's very interesting and very illuminating. Thank you. I appreciate the explanation there. So we've been talking a little bit about early detection. You also mentioned the opportunity or the possibility of mobile apps, for example, enabling improved outcomes themselves. So instead of detection, tell us a little more, please, about outcomes. What are examples of outcomes? What are examples of problems in the past in terms of how do you say it, facilitating successful outcomes? And where does mobile come in there?
Classic example you might say is with tracking obesity and tracking the things that lead to obesity, which then has other
Okay.
outcomes thereafter. So if you think about food trackers have become a thing in the last 5 or 6 years. MyFitnessPal is probably the biggest one. There are others, which started out as ways to track exercise, but the companies start to realize that they had people's attention, and therefore, if they had enough of their attention, people would put in the work to track the nutrients of what they were eating. And then you
Okay.
can match by taking measurements regularly. So, do people exercise? Does their weight go up and down because of it? And it does anything overlay that, such as did they eat certain things on certain days, which put them off exercising, for example,
Right.
or made them lose more weight that week. My personal favorite example of this, I use one of these trackers myself, not as much as I should, but it will trigger me with things like on days you eat sausages, you're more successful with your diet. And it's things like that that surprise you.
Right.
But if you actually dig into it, what you're really being told is you were being careful. So if you ate something bad, you probably compensated for it in the rest of the day. But that's subconscious,
Oh, that's
really.
interesting. Yeah, that's extremely interesting. So for example, can I find an app that says if you eat more pizza and drink more beer, you will be more successful in all aspects of your life?
I could build you one if you wanted
Yes, please.
it.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
not come
yeah.
across one. I'm sure they do exist,
I'm
but
ready to be customer number one immediately.
within the boundaries of other apps that do these things, that's the sort of it's almost the gamifying of success. Like if you're encouraged to log more information, it tells you the interesting things that make it worthwhile. Therefore, you
Indeed.
keep doing it. It's
Yes.
very similar to how social media works and the way people get addicted to it. And the more
Yes.
you feed the machine, the more it feeds you back. And it's
Yes.
turning that to a good use that's the
That's very
important thing.
interesting. Yes. Is this in the broader realm of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or are they not necessarily directly connected to each other?
There is a crossover. I mean, if you think about that, there's two things I was going to say on this actually. So in terms of people applying CBT to themselves, having some direction on it is the main thing, and knowing the steps to go through and repeating the steps, and actually
Sure.
having that pattern to live by, which is
Yes.
part of the therapy in the first place. The thing you
Yes.
have to try and avoid is that people with certain conditions can actually be made worse by gamifying technology. So you might find, and I think the surveys back this up, that people with depression, for example, sometimes only discover it or are triggered into it having been addicted to social media or to regular use of technology. So you have to
Okay.
watch the borderline between overdoing it with people who may actually become worse by overuse of technology, and the more sensitive use of guided assistance and guided therapy. So
Right.
that's the fine line you have to balance, and
Yes.
it's done by proper research and evidence-based development. So when you develop these apps, as we do, Waracle wouldn't go out and develop something in its own right as a good idea for an application. We would do it with the backing of medical experts who tell us the guardrails of what we're building within. So if they have a particular pathway they want to digitize, for example, we have to design research and ultimately test with cohorts of people to make sure this is doing what it's designed to do. It's a scientific
Okay.
experiment as much as anything else. So
Sure. So, in that respect, how therefore are these products developed with the clinical requirement in mind, including not just, is this done? Is this medically valid? Are we collecting good evidence? Are we using proper clinical trial protocols and so forth and so on? But I'm also wondering, for example, we see on Twitter sometimes a GP will post a tweet saying, hello, fellow primary care clinicians. My patient came into my office this morning and said, hello, doctor, I'm having trouble sleeping. Here's my Fitbit data. And the doctor said, here's your what? And so what are issues relating to these apps, consumers, what do you call it? The empowerment of consumers regarding healthcare and clinicians.
empowerment's a whole separate topic. We'll maybe come back to that. But it does drive some of this. So it's the example you gave. If somebody turned up at a clinician with certain data that it's dirty data, because there may well have been a reason that they couldn't sleep, and that's made them not sleep even more, and that the condition has snowballed because they're actually measuring it. You're almost gamifying yourself at that point. So you present that to the doctor, it's probably it'll be put to the side, other than the fact they've said they have a sleep condition. I think what you would want to do, and these applications have their place. They're really about collecting information that can assist somebody to a starting point for a diagnosis. In doing this properly, you would start with a hypothesis that by applying technology, you would enable a particular outcome. Now, it might be that in developing something like a sleep application, for example, some people in the experiment may have as accurate as you can find sleep data based on audio patterns, based on movements. It could be a watch detecting your arms moving in the night, these sort of things. The other half of the trial may be people recording how they feel.
Okay.
And you actually apply quantitative information from people's memory, or even an observed trial where people are actually watched sleeping whilst they're being measured, and you actually benchmark it against real data. So there are many ways you can do these things, but done with efficacy, that's how it would be done. So you wouldn't just record things and take a guess. You would apply some actual rigor to it. Now, the empowerment side of it's interesting, because what you've described is probably not much different than somebody turning up at the doctor having Googled, I had a headache, and because they find something, it probably puts the idea in their head that they have a certain condition, and they've already made their mind up, and they're expecting a certain response, which the doctor can't give. So it's a dangerous road to go down if you take it the wrong path and just give people endless information. But done correctly, that the sort of use of technology is done with scientific rigor, that it's actually useful for positive benefits.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I understand. And that's a helpful clarification. Thanks for that. So, David, our listeners would love to hear your personal story, if that's okay. Maybe you could share with us just a little bit about your background, what you studied, how you got to where you are now, any particular aspects of your career you'd like to share. Everyone always is very happy to hear about people's journeys.
That's a good one. So I am originally an accountant. So I don't come from this world at all, really, by trade. I
Okay.
studied towards chartered accountancy, so I started out as a numbers guy. But my break into digital was probably about 27 years ago. So I'm showing my age a little bit. But I was working with a government department which had a branch working with very small schools, which might have had one teacher who also did the accounting, who did the cooking, the cleaning, and all sorts in the country.
Wow. Yeah.
They had an application originally which let them track their budgets, and in Scotland where I live, they were given an amount to buy pencils and books and things, out of which they could save money to buy school trips, and it was up to them to
Okay.
account for it. And so I built some applications, early 90s, actually, pardon me, early 90s,
Wow. Wow.
which gave them the empowerment to run their own budgets, and I just got kind of addicted to it. So everything I've done since has been about making people's lives easier one way or the other, or more pleasant one way or the other. Whether it's media, I was early adopter in working with newspapers. I built newspaper archives, which help people do genealogy, for example, that help
Nice.
research the family tree,
Yes.
to TV, and some of the world's first TV streaming services and things like that, and passed through companies like Skyscanner and Amazon in commerce, and I've ended up in health and finance now with Waracle. But it's all very similar. If you actually think of the user and the consumer first, the rest tends to follow. So
Nice.
that's been the life.
Excellent. Oh, that's very interesting. And now that I know you're an accountant, I'd like to ask you to help me with my taxes, but we can do that some other time.
You can never escape that, believe me.
So tell us about Waracle, please. We'd love to hear about the business, how long it's been going, what are examples of clients, and obviously not asking you to divulge anything which is confidential, but love to hear about the business and the services you provide.
Actually, from some of the things we talked about, Waracle originally came from the gaming industry in Scotland, which is very healthy. If you're in the gaming world, you would know not Waracle. People like Microsoft produced Minecraft, but that originated in Dundee. Things like Grand Theft Auto, very famous worldwide hit game, came from Dundee originally. And so Waracle was in that space, but eventually pivoted because they realized the techniques that are applied to gaming, as I said, have a place elsewhere, whether it's commerce or especially healthcare. It's actually got some benefits. So Waracle has just spiraled from being a fairly small team in 2007 through to, I think we're well over 300 now, mostly technologists as opposed to business people. We're very heavy with technology expertise, and on the way through, Waracle provides all sorts of solutions from mobile apps back to cloud systems and all points in between for some major banks in the UK and elsewhere. And also in the healthcare world, we deal with major pharmaceutical research and enabling some of the clinical trials that go on to make sure people are actually doing what the trial demands of them, make sure they understand the guidelines of the trial, the ins and outs, and when it starts and ends. And it may sound like admin, but that's the bit that makes the trial work, because the data is not complete unless people understand what they're doing and actually do it.
Yes.
But we essentially think about technology from users' point of view and very heavily depend on the good design process that comes before technology to discover what the needs are.
Exactly.
And how best to apply technology to deliver a successful outcome. So let's see, we're about 310 people or thereabouts at the minute, and about 80% of us are technologists one way or the other. So that's really how we think about things.
Nice. Excellent. Still based in Scotland?
Based all over the UK now, actually. So we have, given the last year of COVID, people work all over the place anyway, regardless of where the offices are.
Sure.
So we're now mostly remote, but we have presence London, Scotland, and people are spread out far and wide over England now as well.
Yes.
So it's a good world to be in, actually. In our world, it doesn't really matter where you work as long as you can communicate and commit the work. So it's good for us.
The silver lining, I suppose, of the pandemic.
Slightly so, yeah.
Yes. So, can you give us examples of a specific product or service you've developed, or is all of that confidential?
In healthcare, they are largely, I can't name the brands, but I can tell you one we're in the middle of looking at without saying who it's for. But if you imagine, I described some of it already, but if you think about the application of different forms of technology to spot early symptoms that people aren't aware of. So a good example, if you were to present yourself to a general practitioner with a particular condition on your foot, then the practitioner might look at that and think you've cut yourself or something like that. But actually, what you may have done is had the onset of a particular condition. I say it's diabetes in that example. So that may just be a very early symptom that even you as a patient might know and the GP may not diagnose early. Now,
Okay.
we're working on how to enable a pathway to spot that is actually an early symptom of a particular disease, which, as I said before, may lead to an amputation, which is quite a common outcome. And to apply technology such as, has the foot changed shape? Has the circulation within the foot changed over time? And can it be mapped to examples of people who have had that particular condition before, so we know that's the likely path to follow, and things like that. So that's a particularly good one, which could enable a brand new pathway of diagnosis much earlier and with much better outcomes than has happened before. There are many like that. It's really about spotting patterns of human behavior and human symptoms that can be detecting something entirely different.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Oh, no, that's helpful. Thank you for the clarification there. We were talking earlier, and the theme of consumer empowerment came up, and you said, well, obviously that's something we could talk about for one 12-hour show in and of itself. But we do have a little bit of time, and I think our listeners would find that particularly interesting because the world is changing, isn't it? And the world of 50 years ago, when the doctor knew everything and was perhaps the most respected person in the village, to now when people go to the doctor and say, hey, here's my ailment, I've Googled it, can you prescribe me this pill, please? So the world is changing, and we're curious to learn about how healthcare will be provided in the future, from maybe a historical scenario where clinicians are delivering healthcare services to a future scenario where there's a mixture, isn't there, of people looking after themselves, amateur neighbors delivering healthcare because they have more time to Google things than you do, to the opposite extreme, of course, which is the professionally trained, expert, qualified clinician. What are you guys observing in this world of consumer empowerment, and where is that going?
There are all sorts of ways you could get into the subject. That essentially, people have got used to, especially in the last 18, 24 months, having more control over their lives than they've ever had before. Even if it was driven down by government need or public health need, people are actually starting to think that maybe they can drive their lives a little bit differently, especially when you think about away from the medical world. A lot of teaching has happened within the home this last year and a half. I know my son and I, we sit over the screen doing homework that we'd never have done before in that particular way, and even through the day when schools were closed. And it's the same in the health world. Now, the thing that you have to do is try to make a virtue of that it actually does help the system, and not, as we've said, present it with problems that don't exist because people are misinformed. So if you think about in COVID, one of the things that has empowered the healthcare system as much as the patient has been the remote monitoring of people who may have ended up in hospital for observation. So if you think, a lot of people don't want to be in hospital for observation, just effectively like being in a hotel for a few days to keep an eye on them.
Yes.
So with COVID in particular, people were sent home last year on a trial with an oxygen monitor just attached to their finger like a clamp.
Right.
And the hospital could see through the application of technology and the internet, which wouldn't have been there 20 years ago, they can tell if that patient's oxygen movements are worth watching. Otherwise, they can effectively be left alone and they will likely recover. But if the oxygen starts to dip, the hospital has a way to intervene and say, right, we can send an ambulance around to pick up that patient, or at least do a double check that it's not a faulty machine or that kind of thing. So that's empowering somebody to be at home with people who care for them in their own environment, as opposed to being stuck in hospital for days on end. But it empowers the healthcare system to not have beds taken up by really routine observational work.
Sure.
There are many more cases to it. So if you think about the push from primary care to community care in the last year, where GPs have effectively adopted a total triage policy, where in the past you would have a queue, you might wait in line for an appointment in the morning, and if you don't get one, you try the next day. If it's too urgent, you can phone another number and beat the queue that way. Now they do triage on everyone, so it's almost made things a bit more democratized. The cases that genuinely need to see the GP are not beating the clock. They're actually presenting reasons to see the GP.
Yes.
And
Yes.
by applying different ways of consulting that don't involve people in waiting rooms and GPs having in and out and cleaning and all the things that would have to happen nowadays, taking those to a telecare platform on video or something like it, actually increases the amount of time doctors can spend with more patients as opposed to less of individual ones. So again, that empowers people to actually. Some people don't like to present themselves to the GP until they have to, but it would mean they actually jump the queue and get seen where they might not have done before in the lottery of a phone line. So if you imagine, there's empowerment in all parts of it. And even in terms of the things we talked about in long-term prevention, the empowerment for people to take their own blood pressure every day and record it to a service that would be seen by a doctor, as opposed to doing it once a month, where it may become a bad outcome all of a sudden, or once a quarter, or whatever the diagnosis might have been. Yeah. You can actually empower yourself to do things like that. And even take it a step further. Many people nowadays are happy, and I think I saw a survey where about 50% of people would be willing to take their own blood tests routinely.
Wow. Wow.
So whereby you might go to the nurse because you have a particular thing and they have to test for anemia or iron, or either way around, or that kind of thing. My mum, for example, has to go and get blood checked every Monday. She has a particular iron condition.
Yes.
That can now be taken home. And I did one of these the other week where you just pierce your finger, like almost like a diabetic would test for glucose, and drip some blood into a tube and send it off in the post. And they can analyze lots of things that would have been a specific laboratory request in the past. You're empowering yourself to make some decisions, and it might just be that the test would come back and say, go and buy some vitamin C, or go and buy some vitamin D, or whatever it might be that the blood offers you. At least you're choosing to make the decision to find out before it's a clinical need that you've had a reason to take a blood test. So there are many ways this works out, but it's all about putting people in control of their lives a bit more, and ultimately, hopefully, that it brings things forward early enough that people aren't presenting ill. They're presenting either worried well, or they're presenting information, as you've said, but collected properly. So yes. It's not going to go away.
Very, very interesting. Yes. Part of, I guess, the broader requirement that we have in society to move towards well-being as opposed to sick care, which is the current healthcare service, obviously, is sick care. Currently, you call your doctor when you're unwell, not when you're feeling fine and thinking maybe something's going to happen 5 years from now.
That's right. I've heard commentators say the NHS in the UK is the National Ill Health Service, but in the past it kind of was, because you wouldn't choose to go there unless you had to. And I did some work in the past with pre-COVID with people like Public Health England, who spend absolute fortunes trying to persuade people to be healthy. Now, it's at the very sort of marketing end of things. It's not clinical. Nobody's taking blood to say, right, keep an eye on your vitamins and things. But if you can empower people to run, which is one of the campaigns they do all the time. So Couch to 5K is a massive success, where you're effectively making it easier for people to step into walking and running over 6 or 8 weeks. That ultimately makes them healthier. So it's a prevention exercise. And there are many examples of that, but it's worth knowing that Couch to 5K was invented by a designer from the technology world who wanted to gamify his own progress towards a 5K run.
No way.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't a health thing, and it wasn't a commercial thing.
Yes.
A guy in the States just invented a procedure to get you from a little bit of a walk and some gentle running, but repeated 3 times a week to the point you come out fit enough to run a 5K in half an hour, and which is roughly what people should do. So
yes, exactly. So let's wrap up now, David. We're running out of time, I'm sorry to say, but this has been an unbelievably interesting conversation, and I've certainly been grateful for your time and all the insights that you have generously shared with us. One thing our listeners love to hear about is a view of the future and the challenges that we have now in society and in healthcare, the application of technology to try and address those challenges. the incumbent risks that new technology has in untried products and services. What's your view of the future? Where do you see some of these mobile apps going? What type of opportunities or world do you see, say, for example, 5 or 10 years from now? And where will mobile apps be in that picture?
I think in the future, if you think about what goes into making a mobile app, that's the sharp end of it, the thing in your hand. But actually, the majority of the work in building something good is about the environment, the contexts, and the knowledge applied to that particular experience. So if you think
Right.
about the things we talked about, the sensors in an Apple Watch can tell an awful lot about you and other watches which are available. Those things will be unbundled over time. So it's not so much that you'll be attached to a piece of technology necessarily, or choosing
Okay.
to proactively use one like a mobile app. It may
Right.
be beyond that. I've spent a lot of time in the last few years working in the world of assistance. So I'm sure you've used one of the major, or heard of one of the major assistant platforms where you can ask an assistant to play music and set timers. Siri's one of the main ones on my watch. I'm just making sure she doesn't trigger, having said that. They know a lot about you because they are gathering information all the time. Now, that seems to be something people don't like, but it can be put to good. If you are, for example, connecting a piece of technology to your world and it knows it needs to do something, that thing can tell somebody else whether it's happened or not. And there's a very good example that has been tried in laboratory conditions where
Okay.
somebody in the house may have a medicine box with their daily doses in it, which is connected to an assistant in the middle, if you imagine. And now each day it knows by the weight of the box whether a pill's been taken out or not at the time of day it was meant to be taken. If that has not happened, that piece of sensory tech, which you've opted in to use,
Yep.
can tell your immediate family through the medium of the assistant, granddad hasn't taken his medicine today. You're then empowered to go and do something about that. And other sensors around that same environment, such as maybe a watch or a pendant that can tell if they've fallen or not, can feed similar information to them.
Nice.
So I think it's this whole ambient collection of data for a very good use
Yes.
can be put together proactively to do things for people that they might forget to do, or they might not be able to do,
Sure.
and that then adds, like we've talked about, it adds empowerment to the community to run Medicare for themselves up to a point, and not rely on systems to apply expensive technology, which may have been the case in the past, to remind you to do things. And that ultimately leads to better outcomes. Now, you can overlay that in any scenario. It might be that you converse with the assistant and it gets a daily pattern of how you're feeling. And there have actually been some tests where people just regularly converse, especially teenagers, in one trial I've seen, where they
Right.
converse with a particular assistant. In their case, the one I've seen was a cat, where people are actually happy talking to a caricature cat.
Right.
By measuring their temperament and the things they say, that can actually predict physical outcomes, where
No way.
certain ways people behave and express their feelings
Right.
is reflective of possibly stomach conditions and things like that. Believe it or
Okay.
not, there's many things you can learn from just day-to-day things that you do. And I think that's where technology ends up, that you're not actively choosing to do things like logging in an app every day what you eat, like I do currently. It's just happening. You could be taking things out of the fridge and it learns that you ate sausages because you took them out of the fridge that day. And that's an
Yeah.
extreme example, but it just takes things out of people's hands so they don't forget. Therefore, the outcomes are slightly more guaranteed because you're tracking
Yes.
behavior that way. And I think
Yes.
that's where this ends up if it's going to be successful.
Excellent. Well, look, David, that's very, very interesting. And I certainly think these are, if you will, pieces of a puzzle which presents a much more attractive picture of the future than one often reads about in terms of the doom and gloom of technology and large technology companies which allegedly have too much power or know too much about us. So it's refreshing and valuable to hear an alternative view of a positive healthcare future where technology makes a difference, where technology is helping us. It's our servant instead of the opposite, and so forth. So once again, David, great to meet you, and
Likewise.
thank you very much. Congratulations to Waracle on your impressive accomplishments and your contribution to healthcare. We appreciate that, and very keen to keep in touch with you. We hope, of course, you can join us at the GIANT Health event at the end of the month in London.
We will do. Thanks for having us today. Really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Thank
you.
you. So this has been David from Waracle. Once again, my name is Barry Shrier. I'm the founder of Giant Health. This is this week's episode of Healthy Innovators TV. We invite all of our listeners to contact us if you have anything you'd like to contribute, if you'd like to participate in the show, or if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. We hope you enjoy these YouTube videos, so we invite you to like them and to subscribe if that's of interest. And we also would like to invite everybody to come to the Giant Health event. Once again, the website is www.giant.health. The event is from the 30th of November to the 1st of December in London, England. You can buy tickets, and we'd also like to thank our sponsors, our knowledge partner, McKinsey, and our sponsors, Barclays International Bank and Vodafone Business. Thank you also to our sponsors, Eli Lilly and Helpify. We love working with all you guys and glad to have you on board as important collaborators. Thank you very much and good day.
Bye-bye.